Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. There's a lot of people here already, and I think probably a lot more coming in. So hang tight, get a glass of water, and we'll get started really soon. Okay, we're going to jump into it, and I'm sure more people will arrive as we do. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm really, really excited about this. And thank you to all the panelists for being here, and to Cynthia and Jewish Currents for setting us up. I wanted to start by saying that I have to admit that when I saw this afternoon that there were approximately 400 people signed up to attend this event, I was initially a little bit surprised, as well as, of course, delighted. When I learned about Max Stratzfeld's book, Talmud, earlier this year, it was immediately clear to me and to my coworkers that this was going to be an important, fascinating work of scholarship, but it was not immediately obvious that it would be one of the most popular events we've ever hosted. 400 people for the Talmud. Who are they? Can I meet all of them? By which I mean all of you. Is this our cue to start a radical yeshiva? And so I started thinking about what drew me to this book originally, because I would say that on the one hand, I see myself as very much kind of in the niche that this book would be for, as a trans person with an interest in Jewish thought. And on the other hand, I kind of realized that, and I really realized this in reading Max's book, that I actually like almost could not have come in knowing less about the subject, because I have never studied Talmud, like actually in any capacity other than, sometimes kind of like looking things up for the purposes of writing like a Jewish Currents editorial. And I also don't really know that much about trans life, or what we would now call trans life, in the let's say like the pre-modern period at all. And so this actually brought together two really like quite open-ended, uh, intriguing, like deeply kind of close and yet far away topics for me. And I was so curious about what they would look like as they intersected. And so I am really interested to hear about how people on this panel have felt about their own kind of relationship to these subjects. Max is the person who has brought thinking about the Talmud and trans life together in this very particular way. Joy and Jules, who have both done a tremendous amount of thinking on trans history, and for Joy, on like trans Jewish textuality, are coming in from sort of different angles on this. And I would guess that many of you who are out there tonight are also coming in with kind of a kaleidoscope of interests around this. And I'm really curious to see what kinds of questions people have. So, we'll get started in a second. I'm going to let Max take it away. And I did just want to say one other thing that I kind of realized in putting together notes on this afternoon, which is that in the moment that we're having this conversation, there's a fascistic interpretation of biblical writings on gender and sexuality that's an inescapable part of national and global politics right now, and of our intimate lives. And that's what it means to live at a time when, as Jules argued in a piece for Jewish Currents last year, the evangelical right has spearheaded a far-reaching campaign to regulate trans people out of existence. And so in that sense, and this is very much something that that all of you have touched on in your work, the question of what ancient religious texts have to say about people that we now might think of as trans ancestors is actually very much alive and kind of uncannily so. So I was thinking about how that was one other thing that brought me to this conversation, and we'll be interested to talk about that as well. So, our panelists are Max Strassfeld, who's a scholar and the author of Trans Talmud, the historian Jules Gill Peterson, and the poet and religious scholar Joy Layden. And I wanted to start with a question, actually, a very basic explain your book question for Max. If you could start, Max, by kind of defining the basic terms here, like what's the Talmud, and who are the kinds of let's say proto-trans figures that that appear in it, that you're looking at in this book.
Thank you. And thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'm so grateful to you and to Jewish Currents for organizing this. I'm particularly grateful to be in conversation with Joy and Jules because I'm a super fan. So, okay. So what is the Talmud? Who are eunuchs and androgynes? I'm going to do a quick and dirty introduction to the book, 5 minutes tops. If there are folks that want more of the Hebrew terminology, feel free to ask, but I'm going to try and make it a fairly basic introduction. Okay. So just to review, when we're talking about the Talmud, we're talking about a composition that's found in a broader body of literature called rabbinic literature. And rabbinic literature originates in the first 6 centuries of the Common Era. It's the product of a movement called the Rabbinic Movement that is found between Roman Palestine and the Sasanian Empire to the east. And I'm oversimplifying a bit, but that's the kind of broad when and where we are. So you can imagine it's a little bit difficult to study historically. We're talking about literature that comes from 600 years, 2 different empires, a little bit hard to pinpoint. The book studies eunuchs and androgynes specifically, but what the rabbis mean by the terms eunuchs and androgynes is pretty different than how we tend to use those in English. So I'll just briefly explain. For the rabbis, there are different types of eunuchs. There's a eunuch who we would call assigned male at birth, who undergoes changes to their body and genitalia later in life. That's what we tend to think of as a eunuch today when we use that word, which actually comes from the Greek. But for the rabbis, there's also men and women who are born with bodily differences that mean that they're not going to grow up to be able to procreate. And those people, for them, are also eunuchs. So very different conceptions, very different conception from how we think of as the word eunuch. More in line with what they were talking about in late antiquity, other cultures, surrounding cultures, how they were using the term eunuch. Then there's some figures that I'm calling androgynes in English, One of them is described in early rabbinic sources as having two sets of genitalia, so that they may, for example, be able to menstruate. They may also be able to have seminal emissions. And the other is a tumtum. And the tumtum is described differently in different places. But the basic essence of the tumtum is that the rabbis are not sure what their sex gender is. So they're a category of doubt. We don't know. So when I talk about eunuchs and androgynes in rabbinic literature, that's kind of shorthand for a whole host of different kinds of figures that are found not just once or twice, but rather prolifically spread throughout the body of literature. We have hundreds of different mentions of these categories. The question then would be, what kind of work are they doing within rabbinic literature and rabbinic legal discourse? And I also want us to notice none of these exactly matches our definitions of intersex or trans. It's not a one-to-one correspondence for all sorts of reasons, but we can even just see in how they're organizing it. It's not organized in the same way. So in the book, when I talk about transing the Talmud, transing as a verb, playing with that prefix trans, which is not a term that I invent. It's fleshed out by Susan Stryker, Paisley Carra, and Lisa Jean Moore in Women's Studies Quarterly. One of the ways I'm using transing is to think about how eunuchs and androgynes are functioning in rabbinic literature. And I do that in a couple ways. One way is to think about how certain bodies are made to carry the weights of particular kinds of failures, bodily failures. So for example, anyone who's ever struggled to have a child can tell you that reproduction, even when you have all the necessary components to hand, is never guaranteed. So when we talk about reproductive failures in rabbinic literature, the rabbis generally acknowledge there are all sorts of situations in which people who are trying to make babies may fail to do so, that reproduction is a fraught enterprise. And we have stories about infertility in the Bible and in rabbinic literature. So in analyzing these eunuchs that can't reproduce, right, that's one of the defining characteristics. What is it that makes their procreative failures unique or pathological exactly? And asking those kinds of naive questions of these sources can sometimes help us to figure out what are some of the underlying logics of how these texts are treating androgynes and eunuchs. So that's the kind of, in a nutshell, here's the who, what, when, where, and a little bit of my approach to thinking about these characters in the sources.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really helpful place to start in terms of who these people are, whose bodies are being regulated by the Talmud. And I wanted to ask a question about the kind of text that the Talmud is in relation to those characters. Something I was thinking about when I was chatting the other day with the Max and Joy together is that it seems to me that you both do kind of trans readings of ancient Judaic texts, but that actually in some ways those texts are kind of different from what I've seen of the work that the two of you guys have produced. And Joy, I know I obviously both of you have written a ton, and so I realize I'm just scratching the surface here. But Joy's work that I'm familiar with is looking at, in a sort of lyrical way, at texts from the Torah, from the scriptures that might speak to trans experiences in some kind of allegorical way, which seemed to me possibly different than looking at the Talmud, which is an actual legal code that's talking about literal kinds of bodies like eunuchs and androgynes, and talking about kind of who can go where, what appropriate kinship structures are, who's allowed to have sex with whom. And it struck me that that's maybe, and I don't know if I'm getting this distinction right or if you guys disagree. But it seemed to me that that might be a kind of difference in how we read certain kinds of trans archives, whether we're looking at work that can be read in a more allegorical way, or work that is really operating as a kind of legal system. And that struck me as interesting, partly because I think as a reader today, and I guess for me as a non-observant Jew, I don't think that those those kinds of texts both kind of read as literary to me. Right? Like I don't because I don't observe Jewish law, the Talmud for me doesn't really operate as a legal code. It operates as as a a kind of a like a document that tells me about the past as opposed to a document that regulates the way that I live my life. And so, yeah, I'm curious about where those where there might be differences as well as convergences there, and also how that might be different for people reading these texts who are more religious or less religious or coming from other religious traditions. Yeah, just curious how you both think about that.
Ari, I don't really know what you mean by my reading texts allegorically. In fact, when I was in a PhD in English program, I failed to really understand the whole allegory thing. Spencer was just a dark night of the soul for me. Um, so, so if I'm allegorical, it is inadvertent, a Keystone Cops allegorical reading. But I think in general, part of the distinction that you're seeing is apart from the I'm reading narratives in the Torah as opposed to the many different kinds of things that Max is reading. Sometimes I read laws, but mostly, when I do things about regulating bodies. But a lot of what I'm doing is reading narratives, and the way I'm reading them is not about bodies. It's not about sex so much as about gender, in this fundamental kind of distinction. So it's not clear to me whether there's and whether how much Jewish tradition has a discourse of gender as distinct from talking about bodies that have obligations that need to be regulated. So there's a lot about what I would call the sex, or the bodies that are differentiated by different sexual characteristics like reproductive capacity. But gender is a system of identification, self-identification, and identification by others. So it overlaps with what Max was talking about in terms of the rabbinical discussions, in that the rabbis developed a system for identifying these different kinds of bodies. That system of identification is analogous to gender systems, but it's not clear to me if it's a gender system in the sense that I would talk about it, because it leaves out self-identification. It leaves out a sense of how the individuals who are being identified from the outside see themselves. So a gender system enables individual human beings who I think struggle with a terror of being utterly unique, and I think also struggle to identify other people as human. Gender provides a symbolic mediation, a set of interpretations of bodies that say, these kinds of bodies are human, these kinds of variations mark bodies as, because standard male and female bodies, they look pretty different when they're naked. What's to say they're even the same species, right? Well, gender is a system of symbolic interpretation of those bodies that says, no, these are parts of the same species. The species has these certain kinds of variations. And then as soon as human beings start differentiating things, we start piling on all kinds of other symbolic meanings on top of that. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for in the Torah, and looking for ways that current understandings of gender can help us read the Torah, that the Torah can help challenge us with current understandings of gender. So it's very different in both the text that I'm talking about and the approach. But I want to actually, Max, I'm wondering if I just made a total hash, because in talking about what I'm talking about, I may have completely misrepresented what you're doing.
Yeah, I don't, first of all, no, you didn't make a match of anything. And I love hearing you talk about your hermeneutic, like how you think about interpretation and the project of interpretation. I don't know that the Talmud is a legal code. I think that happens later, but it's legal imaginings for sure. It's imagining a a way of organizing and regulating the world. We don't know the extent to which they were actually successful at imposing that view, because we don't have a lot of material evidence from the time period. And there's historians now who say, they probably weren't actually very popular for the first couple centuries of the rabbinic movement. It really takes off when the Roman Empire Christianizes, and then people hop on board the rabbinic movement. But might have been just small groups of scholars sitting around. So the extent to which they were able to really regulate anything, that's an open question. But I do think that the discourse of law, that the idea that we regulate bodies and those questions of who can have sex with who, and I agree, Joy, I don't think they have a sex gender system. The person who would be the best person to speak about the development of the system of gender is Jules. But I don't think that that's a framework that they're working in. And even if we use gender as a frame to talk about what's happening in the Talmud, for them, gender is about who you can marry and your priestly status and impurity and all sorts of things that we don't associate with the category of gender altogether. So even when we use that word, it means something, even if we were to, it means something radically different for them. But I think, it's a basic, there's been a feminist debate about these legal texts in rabbinics for ages. Is any kind of liberation ever built on legal discourse? And I think that's an open and good question. And it's funny to me, the extent to which there's so much queer and trans activism around the Talmud right now. I love it. I totally love the Talmud, and I totally love Svara and all of these radical groups who are reading and engaging the Talmud. It's not meant to discourage those efforts. And I think it's really interesting that there's been such an investment in these legal texts, which I also read narratively for rhetoric, to think about how they're imagining bodies and worlds, and alongside you, Ari, but it's interesting.
Thank you both. And yeah, I think as promised, this kind of interpretation is actually really new to me. So I think I'm learning a lot even as we speak about I see what you're saying, Max, about the difference between a legal imaginary and an actual code of law that is able to enforce. Which also, just seems really interesting in trying to get at what actually, what kinds of discourses actually kind of matter socially to the people who are living among them. And just seems like another question that is really very provocative to raise in the project of looking back at the lives of people 2,000 years ago. And I guess I'm wondering if, Jules, if you want to jump in and talk about how all of this scholarship kind of reads to you as somebody who is also really interested in looking at the emergence of a discourse of gender, including, sort of archaic, what we would now see as kind of archaic concepts of gender, but in the much more recent past. So, to sort of put it in the opposite direction, it seems like it's kind of, something that's always really head spinning, I guess, about queer history and trans history, even looking at the period in the last, let's say, 130 years, when categories of gender and sexuality that we now use were kind of coming into existence. There is still such a vast difference between what those look like, at, let's say, the turn of the 20th century and what they look like today. And so to be a scholar kind of really engaged in that period of time and just how much things have changed, and then to kind of jump back into this completely different cultural context that we know much less about and much longer ago. I'm curious what the experience for you was of reading this and thinking about it in relation to your work.
Well, it's been a thrilling experience. I mean, I have to say, as a forever precocious, school child, I love reading outside of my field, and I'm someone that, has very, very little fluency in the Jewish tradition, maybe even less fluency in the Christian tradition. Knows very, what I learned about Rome, I remember from elementary school, and then whatever I absorbed through Foucault about the Greeks, and so thank you, Max. I'm just so delighted. I think that your book serves up some really interesting things to chew on, and I think raises some really interesting questions, both for all of us as people in the world, and then certainly as scholars as well. I was just thinking about this question of interpretation in relation to law. I mean, we could think about this unfolding in real time right now. If some states follow through on their promise to criminalize drag and, in a sense, reintroduce cross-dressing laws, how will people, if there is, people 800 years from now interpret such a thing, and how would they interpret it vis-a-vis, a moment 150 years ago when cross-dressing was illegal? I mean, what even is the relationship between that? And in fact, what I think, a lot of American historians have been digging into, that the fact that there are actually, incredible degree of trans people out there, even while cross-dressing is illegal. And so where do you draw your sort of, interpretive line? It'll tell a really different story about what that, about what your object is. But I was thinking so much, and this is my big, I'm going to wear this ambivalence proudly tonight and see if it's a useful role to play in this conversation. But I have a great deal of ambivalence about trans. I could just stop the sentence right there. I mean, I have a great deal of ambivalence about its politics today, but I have a great deal of ambivalence about its utility mostly. I mean, trans does a lot of flattening work, even under the guise of radical inclusion, where its umbrella form, right, and where it's supposed to be a heading under which we could find a series of people who maybe don't fit in anywhere, or its prefixial form, right, where it names a kind of energy in the world, a boundary crossing energy, right? And that's a little bit where the transing stuff has come from. But of course, trans in that context was invented in the 1990s, right? And so, part of what's so interesting to me is that, and I think a thing that has been sort of lost, ironically, in transgender becoming just trans, is the gender part fell off, right? In part because we want to acknowledge that, people have a multiplicity of relationships to that category, including none of the above. But to me, it's really important descriptively, empirically, to name trans as a gender-bound category, right? The trans, meaning across, is about traversing some sort of enforced gender, boundary or binary, right? But it also has this particular, history politically and theoretically in the scholarship at one and the same time in relation to a concept of normativity, in which there is a rigid sort of sense of norm. And then there are people who, through their embodiment, through their desires, their predilections, their behaviors, their flair, their verve, transgress the boundaries of that normativity. It's sort of a shadow version of the idea of trans as crossing the gender binary, right? And that really is where all the energy has settled around trans. Right. I just always want to name that, like, that is a political vernacular and a theoretical project that, like, I was born before it got underway in earnest, right? So 1990, so very, very new. So one thing that's so interesting to me is then let's rewind the clock all the way back to late antiquity, right? And it's like, okay, so trans, for us sitting here in the United States in 2022 is this sort of, person bound, right? Identity in one way or another, normativity and gender bound category. But then we arrive in this world where, at least textually, we're given something that doesn't look like gender to me at all, right? It looks something like, and here, you'll forgive my many terrible translations of your work, but, something more like a patriarchal mandate to couch reproductivity in the household. And, these people who are also figures start to appear, the androgynes and the eunuchs, and they play this kind of really productive role. But the role seems not so much about securing a gender binary or delimiting even very obviously like normativity, because that's just like hard to ascribe that to a culture that long ago, but more sort of like a role in guaranteeing what cannot be guaranteed, right? Parentage, how do we know a father's line, really, is passing down properly, right? How do we know children really belong to their parents? And then all of the sorts of cultural and institutional trappings that come along that, especially if it has to do with, being a priest or, with material resources and things like that. And so there it's sort of like, wow, okay, where is trans popping up here? And also, always this kind of question I want to think about, right? Because it's not just like we've just arrived at some random place and time. This set of texts is part of a really pivotal cultural tradition that has had, world historical impacts, over many centuries, over thousands of years at this point, since these texts are starting to be compiled. And so that's a really interesting question. What is at stake here, right? Some of it is history, and there we maybe hit the brick wall really fast because there's only so much work historians can do, right? And one thing I want to flag for folks listening, right, is I think one of the things you do, Max, that's so helpful is you contextualize the cultural milieu in which the rabbis are conversing, writing, right? So it's like they're drawing on, Greek language like eunuch, right? But Greek there being filtered through the Roman Empire, being filtered through the politics of imperial Christianization, being filtered through an imperial rivalry with Persia, right? And so something as seemingly simple on its surface as the eunuch is like, well, is the eunuch just this Greek figure, right? That a bunch of like 19th century dudes blamed for the fall of the Roman Empire, which conditions our received historiography, but then also like apparently the Persians are all about eunuchs, but that might have actually just been like Greeks telling lies about Persians or Persians telling lies, and historians can't really, there isn't necessarily enough archive to go and settle that as a matter of sort of, our best guess empiricism that we like to do, if you're working in eras where there's just more material, right? So that's just history. But then it's like, okay, wait, no, clearly there's myth, right? Mythology, which is like a really difficult, thing to put into interface with history. Then there is the hermeneutic tradition of the rabbis themselves. And it's unclear because we don't know a ton about the history and myth, how influential they are, right? And so it's like, are we getting a weird slice of life from people who are not like, do these folks like know a lot of androgynes and eunuchs? I don't know, right? And then there may be like two other things that come back into a play, which is like contemporary notions of trans and gender, right? And a kind of longing or an impulse to look backwards and to form a mode of relation to the past. And those modes of relations might be religious and spiritual, right? But they also might be sociological. and they're political in the contemporary. I mean, another thing I want to flag about the book for folks is that, like, you spend a lot of time talking about, both contemporary legal attacks on trans people and also the medical enforcement of sex on intersex people, through the medical model, right? And it's like, so here is like, if I just sort of set the table, like, it's a rich feast, right? But very tricky. And I think one question that your book so beautifully opened up for me, right, is like, I want to say polemically, we might have been led to believe trans is a secular category because it evolves, in the United States and the global north amongst sort of, there's a lefty version of it, there's an NGO kind of social service version of it, but it's, nominally secular. It comes out of this kind of queer tradition too, but I actually don't think it is very secular at all. I think it's secular in the way that American secularism and Western secularism is really just Christian millenarianism. The political vernacular is a story about a sinful world of gender norms and oppression and exclusion from the norm. And one day, our good subaltern trans subjects, our Black and brown trans women, will vindicate us and bring about queer utopia through a second coming. I mean, that is really kind of the mode of imagination that I see sort of trafficked, by kind of, left trans, thought more or less in the United States. And so it's like, how do we slide alongside that and ask questions if we're not presuming all of those things, which I think is really helpful, right? But what I love about it is it gets me to this really ambivalent, messy place where I'm like, trans? Like, to me, trans feels less settled after all of this, right? And that's really exciting because a different way of asking the question that your book prompted to me is like, well, yes, when these evangelical Christians refer to Genesis to legislate, like, they're just clearly not reading it right. Right. And it's like really important to push back on that, and push back on the establishment of a Christian fascist nation. But then, like, there's also a really interesting question for all of us, more attached than ever to gender-bound categories, which is like, what if, like, we didn't have gender almost at all? I don't know who the we is here, but most places in the world didn't even have gender. They had lots of other things. And like eunuchs and androgynes were actually really important, but they didn't function in the same way. They weren't necessarily just the excluded non-normative category. They played a more finessed and less obvious role. What does it mean that we've sort of shed all of that in order to arrive at gender and then later at trans, right? I think that's a really fascinating, I mean, it's not like an answerable question, but like, I think it's a question worth asking. I think it's a problem worth falling into. And I think that, the care and attentiveness of your book really, I mean, it really gave me the means to fall into that and kind of get like just delightfully swept up in it, which explains why I'm totally rambling right now. And I'm not sure I've made sense for the last several minutes, but anyways, Ari, I can't even remember exactly what your question was, so I know I haven't answered it, but I hope that gives some, I just wanted to offer a bunch of that in case it's useful and other folks want to dig into it. And yeah. So thank you for indulging me to talk that long too.
Incredible sort of like micro history of like kinship structure and the way it's unfolded. And we got just this, I feel like we just got like an entire kind of like a Anthro 101 vision of like how of like really the kind of most basic questions that that open up in thinking about all of this, which is like as I think all of you have said, if these questions as they are initially kind of introduced in these ancient religious texts are actually regulating kinship structures, and that is kind of their primary entry point into what would later become a process of regulating gender. What even does it mean to kind of relate ourselves to them? Like, that's one thing that I think I'm just really thinking about from what you were just saying, like what does it mean to think about kind of something like trans ancestry if there's not even if we're not even talking about the same kinds of categories, right? Like if like the androgyne and the eunuch are less an earlier kind of like a model of non-normatively embodied gendered subjects, but are actually defined in terms of their roles and their reproductive capacities. So that was just one thing I wanted to kind of draw out from what you were just saying. But Joy, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight a couple of things, and it relates to what you were just saying also, Ari. One is I want to really second Jules and third Jules in saying that trans has become a flattening category, both because, I mean, this is the reason that I think transgender emerged as a term as it was, because if you're going to advocate for an oppressed group, you can't go in and say, okay, here are the 16 different words you have to put into this legislation to protect, right? We need some kind of common umbrella sort of term. So that coalitional aspect becomes flattening. It becomes a shorthand for all kinds of relations to gender and identity, which are actually quite different. But it's also flattening because of what Jules was saying about the trans being defined against presumed normativity. So trans coming in and creating its own binary. Binaries are designed to flatten and simplify. So one of the ways that I read, Christian fascism is fascism. Opportunistic politicians and hate mongers, that's what they are. They did not come to their ideas through readings of the Bible or through religious text or whatever. That's a pretext. However, one of the things that the emergence of the idea of trans identities has done is paradoxically the opposite of what the utopian promise of it was. So rather than helping everybody move toward a much more nuanced vocabulary of ways to be human, a Baskin Robbins approach to ways of being human. The trans cis binary says there's one normative way, and there's one way of not being, everything else is not normative. And the thing is that flattens people on the normative side. I don't actually know anybody who describes themselves as just being an absolutely normal man or woman. Like, you want to know what I am? Look in the dictionary for the definition of man or woman. And that's what I am. That's a complete and exhaustive description of me. In fact, there's a wide range of doing genders that have nothing to do with transness or eunuchness or anything that is, but when trans people enter the conversation, a lot of what I hear when I read, because I try to read seriously some of the anti-trans feedback, some of what people are saying is you are flattening our subjectivity. Number one, you're reminding us that we have subjectivity, right? That we also have individual relations to gender, an individual sense of ourselves. But number two, you're flattening it into you're just vanilla. You're just the folks who are not interesting. You don't have a gender story. You're all the same, and you're all the same all the time. So let's focus on the cool kids. And so there is some, in addition to people feeling destabilized by the emergence of ways of being human that don't fit within binary gender, there's also, I think, this anger at the flattening out of ways of doing gender that are not trans, that are incredibly rich and variegated. And this example for me that I would use are my modern Orthodox Jewish women students at Stern College. They lived at least two versions of the gender binary simultaneously that defined woman in completely different ways. So they're modern, so they know the secular American definition of woman. They know the kinds of clothes they're supposed to wear, but I want to focus on one thing. They know that at the age of 20, a secular American woman is considered quite young, still finding herself and growing. And this is a class thing and everything. There are many different forms of binary gender. Actually, I'm zeroing in on one, but these kids were upper middle class mostly. So that's the thing that they were glomming onto. But Orthodox culture defines them as being old. Like you are already and into a time when you should be married and having children. And in fact, Phi Beta Kappa students would feel like failures if they hadn't gotten married. They would have to create marriage resumes that they would take to marriage brokers. It didn't matter if you were doing a PhD at Harvard. In terms of your Orthodox culture, you're old and heading toward non-reproductive status. You're not actually becoming a eunuch in the sense Max is talking about, but if you don't reproduce, how can you tell the difference between whether you're a eunuch for biological reasons or whether, like you end up in the same kind of category by default, same sort of role that spinster used to play, I think. So their gender is so complex. They have multiple definitions of women that overlap and collide in certain kinds of way. And they have to understand themselves and represent themselves in terms of two not totally different gender systems. These gender systems overlap, but they are quite different. The secular gender system is not a sacred gender system. It doesn't say wearing a certain kind of clothing enables you to have proximity to God or gives meaning. It's like, no, it enables you to be considered attractive or, hip or whatever it is. So I thought it was great that you referred to trans as having this flattening effect. And I think it would be terrible for us to flatten out the past by saying, hey, we have these fabulous newfangled categories. Now let's export them back for a few thousand years and flatten that out. So I also liked very much Jules pointing out that when we stop trying to read Max's book, because Max is transing the Talmud, which is different than, does anybody else other than me remember the Saturday Night Live routine, find the popes in the pizza? Yeah. Anyway, like this is the way I think of people who look for evidence of people who we would call trans in ancient texts. You're looking for the popes in the pizza, in a certain, but that's not what Max is doing. Max is using trans perspectives and awareness and the tools that have developed in it to think about how these categories function in the Talmud's discourse and to some extent through a glass darkly in the cultures that the Talmud is growing out of and referring to. So Max is demonstrating, and I think Jules is referring to the fact that Max is demonstrating that we can take advantage of the intellectual resources that recognizing that there are many different ways to do gender and to think about sex, and that which is basically to say there are a lot of different kinds of human bodies and different cultures interpret those bodies in very different ways and point to different parts of them as being important and different parts as being unimportant, right? Which I think was what Judith Butler was trying to say at great length in Gender Trouble. But, like being left-handed is not seen as a gender category, but it could be, just the way that we don't say not being able to reproduce is a distinct gender category. So recognizing that that this is something that human beings do, and we do it in many different kinds of ways, enables us to leverage. We can't really see into the past, but we can try to at least peek above the situation that we've been born into and are living in, and recognize some of the assumptions that are shaping the ways that we're processing both our own lives and the people around us, but also the ancient texts that we read. And so I think I've achieved misrepresenting Jules and Max at the same time. So I'm gonna,
Should I respond or yeah, I wasn't sure when we want to stop for questions too. So there's so much in what both of you said. Thank you so much for the engagement. And I want to pick up two threads which maybe don't relate, and we'll see how it goes. I'm struck by the your ambivalence about that term trans, which I feel somewhat ambivalent too, and ambivalent about what the project of trans history before trans looks like. Like what is the what's the goal of it? Is this a usable past? What are we trying to reproduce? And I think that flattening effect, I'm thinking when both of you are talking about the flattening effect of the problem in queer history, Eve Sedgwick's response to David Halperin when she says, the problem isn't that you're insisting that the past is different from today. The problem is you're assuming you understand what today is. We all share a same definition of what gay is, and that therefore you can establish the alterity, right? You're essentializing the present, not the past. And I think it's a similar problem. And in trying to sort of stay away from a queer subversive framework for reading these sources, right? Then I'm trying to also stay away from a framework of normativity. That's a piece of trying not to read this because I have a certain skepticism about the framework of queer subversion and what that actually does for trans and gender non-normative peoples, which is again in that same problem of normativity. And I'm thinking, I don't know if this is related, but it feels related. I'm thinking of the way that like the first question I always get mostly at whenever I talk about my project is, but did they know people? Like, were there people, right? Were there androgynes? Did the rabbis know androgynes? And the unsatisfying answer is I don't know, right? I don't know. I don't have evidence one way or the other. We know we have records of certain people that called themselves born eunuchs in the Greek tradition in the Second Sophistic movement. So we have some records that exist, but they're few and far between. And I don't know. But the question itself is interesting, right? Like why is that the piece we're the most interested in? Because of the fact that we're making trans and intersex people invisible today, that we're making them not exist today. And so we're insisting on a trans and intersex past as a way to write ourselves into history. But I have an ambivalent relationship to trying to argue my presence right now by resorting to history. Many years ago, I was on a responsa committee for a synagogue, and responses when people write in like questions and you answer them, like usually groups of rabbis. And the queer synagogue I was a part of was like, we're going to form our own responsa committee and people are going to write us questions and we're going to write queer and trans Jewish answers. It was a really beautiful project. And the first thing that they wanted to write was like, yeah, so we exist, right? Like, let's look at the textual evidence to say like trans Jews exist. We are in canonical sources. We have always existed. And I'm sympathetic to that project, right? I understand, this is my community. I totally understand why we want to make that argument. On the other hand, I mean, I exist, fuck it, like I exist. I don't need to turn to any text to say that I exist. And I said, that's not actually that answer is not one I can work on, even though I think it would have helped a lot of people. I don't think the project is wrong. I just don't know that that's the form of trans history that I can participate in. So I have also, I think, an ambivalence about what is it that we're doing in trans history, particularly when we're talking about trans before trans.
I think that one of the problems, and Ari, you've been circling back to this, is that what trans people have done by identifying ourselves as not fitting into the gender binary and then going on to what's grown out of that is because gender is a way of being identified not just by yourself but by other people. What we've done is we've invented in embryo, because it's not very well developed and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet, but we've developed in embryo different ways of doing gender, different, what may someday be different gender systems, as highly elaborated as some of the different binary gender systems that we live among today in this culture. Trying to, keep the human beings are a mess. We are not normative. That's why we have these categories. If human beings were all the same, then we wouldn't have categories. We wouldn't have abstract categories. They'd be completely unnecessary. It's because we're not normative by nature that we have all of these different categories, because otherwise it's hard to be known except as idiosyncratic, unique individuals, which sounds great, except when you try to do it and realize nobody understands who the heck you are, what you want, what you value, and nobody sees themselves as being like you, and nobody accepts it when you say you're like them. So it can be a very lonely position to have absolute self-determination. But I think that that's what we're doing with contemporary trans identities. There's this embryonic other idea of doing gender that's based on self-identification primarily and identification by others secondarily. And we haven't really figured that part out yet. And that's what we can't bring into the past. Because I think one thing that we know about the past is that it is highly unlikely that anybody before quite recently, as Jules was saying, was thinking about gender in these kinds of ways. Were there people who didn't fit into whatever ways there were to do gender? Guaranteed. Were there bodies that were intersex? Absolutely. Were there people who didn't reproduce? Yes. But what wasn't the case, because there weren't a bunch of visible people saying, we want to be recognized the way Max is saying, I exist. That's it. I exist. I'm here. I exist. That's part of my public identity. Groups of people saying, we want to create gender systems that will enable people to know us, despite the fact that we don't fit into the gender system that people are accustomed to living. That I have not noticed in the past.
Thank you all. I think this is I think you all have kind of arrived at the conversation that I wanted to close us out with, at least before taking questions, which, by the way, if anybody has questions, there's a very lively chat going on, but I'm not seeing any questions yet that could be posed to the panelists as such. So if anyone has them, put them in, let's say by 8 o'clock, and we can take a couple. But I think that what I'm hearing you all winding up at is kind of a conversation about the stakes of Jules. I think you were the person who was referring to the question of whether we're like reading the text correctly, reading them right, and the larger question of what it means. Oh, am I looking at the wrong? Am I in the wrong place? Looking at the questions here. Okay, hang on. We'll come back to that in a sec. But oh, I see. It's in the Q&A chat. Got it. Okay, great. So we will turn to those in a sec. But yeah, what I'm hearing everyone kind of circle around here is the kind of ambivalence around the recuperation of ancient texts as such, in a kind of attempt to read against the grain of the right-wing fundamentalist interpretations that would say what we can take from Genesis 1:27 is the idea that there are that there are men and there are women, and like a direct arrow pointing to therefore trans people shouldn't be able to use the bathroom that they need to go to, right? Like there's a way of looking back at these texts and saying, actually, maybe there is a more liberatory vision that we can take from them, and that might have some import today, whether that's because of people's individual spiritual and religious practices, or in a more kind of instrumental way, because it gives us something to say back to the fascists, to say, actually, you're reading the Bible wrong, we're reading it right. And I think something I'm hearing all of you say, and also seeing in the chat, is people saying, well, that's not necessarily the political move that feels like it actually kind of feels authentic to the situation, in which really what we are living through is lives and bodies and categories that are being constructed in the present, and then just have these very old texts as these kind of echoes that we're all moving through. So I think now that I'm seeing these questions in the Q&A, I will take a couple of them. So I think, let's see here. And if you guys want to look at them too, and choose any that seem particularly interesting to you, you definitely should. I'm gonna actually start with one that I think is super interesting, and that I hadn't thought about, that Jacob Rom put in the Q&A. Since the tumtum, androgynes, and other gender category of the Talmud are primarily characterized by genital differences, Jacob said, I'm curious about how circumcision might relate to that. Could it be seen to operate in a similar way in terms of delineating social and ritual roles and marriageability and so forth? And thinking about a Talmudic passage in which the mashuk, the person who has stretched their foreskin to reverse their circumcision, is mentioned in proximity to the tumtum and androgynous. So I think, Max, that one would be for you.
That one's for me. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so the short answer to that is yeah. So first of all, they're very interested in thinking about genitalia. The chapter in Yevamot, Liver Marriage, in the Mishnah, that talks most about eunuchs, starts with Harel, which is the uncircumcised priest, and then goes into eunuchs. And I think that organization is not an accident. So they're thinking about genital difference in a variety of ways, and normative genitalia for them would be, for the penis, would be circumcised, right? So that certainly comes into the discussion, and we see texts about there's a legal issue around the androgyne and whether you can, there's questions of what laws you can break on the Sabbath to circumcise someone, because it's supposed to be the 8th day. So it falls on Shabbat. There's certain rules you can break that you wouldn't normally be able to break. What about the androgyne? Can you circumcise the androgyne on Shabbos? Their status as a man, is it enough to break the rules of Shabbat? So it's not like they ever say, is the androgyne man enough, right? But in all sorts of ways, they're asking questions about, within their kind of system of legal thinking, about how to think about these bodies and organize them. So I think that hopefully answers a little bit of the question.
Very quick note based on what Max was saying. In terms of political utility, I don't think that there are very many communities where that's the burning question around sex and gender. But what strikes me over and over again is that when the rabbis who were thinking about communities that were, where the ways communities were living on a day-to-day basis were supposed to reflect relationship with God and make a place for God, right? These were supposed to be sacred communities. To what extent they actually were or not is, arguable, but that was the idea. When the rabbis were thinking about different kinds of bodies, they could have said, look, these kinds of bodies have no place in a sacred community. They simply can't fit into the categories that you need to fit into, like that one, right? Like males get circumcised. If you don't definitely fit into the category of male, we're just throwing you out in terms of circumcision. If you have a penis, it can't be circumcised in a way that reflects the covenantal relationship with God. That is not what the rabbis did. They did not see religious sacred communities as requiring homogeneity. And that is one of the, the toxic forms of fundamentalist Christianity, which is not all Christianity. It's not even most Christianity, but these toxic forms are forms that say what is sacred is homogeneity. We need to erase people and bodies and members. We need to get rid of them, or cure them, or force them to recant in some kind of way. We need to restore homogeneity, because that is the sign of God's presence. And that, I think, when you look into the past, you can see that has not historically been required by the sacred communities that make up the Jewish tradition, or I think the Christian tradition in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot more range of acceptance in sacred Christian communities also. This is not historical. It's not even deeply rooted. Christians didn't learn how to hate trans people until, 15 years ago. So it is highly unlikely that God decreed hatred of trans people when creating the first human beings. But if so, Christians have really not been belated in catching up to God's will.
There's one more question from the Q&A that I think I'm gonna choose to close this out. It's a really different kind of question. It's the last question on here from, the second to last question on here from Ray Levy. What is the panelist relationship to body and soul? How would the panelists talk about transness and the spirit or spirituality?
What a beautiful question. I mean, I think it's, in a broad kind of polycultural, context in which transgender and sexual politics, sort of circulate in the global north. I mean, there's, been such an abandonment of spirit and soul, which of course could mean 10,000 different things. And I think that, one thing that's interesting to me is it seems like our conversation tonight has helped us push really carefully against maybe two things that would get me to an answer to this question. One is the limits of empiricism, right? Like I work mostly on the 19th and 20th centuries. So, I have that just determination, like, well, if I didn't find out the answer yet, I'll just keep researching for 10 more years. And I'll probably figure something out. There's a vast historiography for me to draw on. There are hundreds and hundreds of other scholars that work on this time period, right? But probably not for the, for the material that, that Vax is so carefully working with, right? And so when you hit that wall of empiricism, it's also partly the fault of the European Enlightenment. You just hit that wall because that's it. Knowledge has a definite form, and reason and truth have a definite form in that particular intellectual Western tradition. And so it's like, well, if you want to get stuck, then you could get stuck. But the question is sort of what's your ethos around not knowing, around the opacity and resistance of the people you encounter, or the texts you encounter in the past, right? There's a beautiful line that recurs in a couple of different forms throughout the book where Max says, I don't want to purchase gender subversion at the cost of the androgynous or the eunuch, right? And I'm so on board with that. But one upside of not purchasing it on the backs of that figure, right, is that you can actually kind of dig into the resistance of that figure to be known at all, right? But where do you boomerang back, with that kind of on that process, right? So there's this limit of empiricism. And then I think there's also this kind of hard limit, right, of debunking fundamentalism, of debunking normativity, of debunking the rules of binary gender, right? All of the misuses, the reductionist, fallacious readings of these texts and figures. It's important, right, to debunk to a certain extent, but then you also hit a place of disenchantment, right, where one, your antagonist has defined your relationship to these things that could be sacred as well. And two, it's also just those are both dead ends. They're the end of inquiry, right? And they're critical, but then they end. And so if you don't want it to be the end, I think that's where the spiritual might begin. That's where soul, might begin. That's where things that exceed reason, as dictated by Western science and humanism might begin. Or instead of seeing this as one thing ending another beginning, where you just, the liveliness of all of this just reemerges, right? I mean, I was thinking a lot about this, and this, last thing I'll say on this, like, as a point of comparison, like I was raised in a cultural and religious context of a very young religion, Sikhism, that's only about 500 years old, and actually does have I think there's a pretty legitimate claim to say like it's a gendered religion, because it's like right around the right time in terms of, Mughal imperialism in North India and, European imperialism, and it's a religion based around, in part, the elimination of the caste system and its replacement with a discourse of radical equality, which includes that men and women should occupy and perform the same roles, more or less. And so there is this real investment in men and women that, because my younger sister is also trans, we joke like how annoying it was to be born into the one subcontinental spiritual tradition with no third gender. Like there's no third gender in Sikhism. You really got to be a man or a woman in order to establish equality in that very, it's like very weird. It's very Western. I mean, it's a weird religion. But one of the things that's so fascinating to me about that, right, is that it changes the kind of hermeneutic relationship to that tradition, right? Is like, well, I can't really go find that one textual nugget, right? But one thing that I've been playing around with lately is sort of looking, into the kinds of literal, it's like, oh, this older, cool, Durga Hindu temple, I have a little Durga behind me, was like torn down, when this guy converted to Sikhism and became totally patriarchal and his wife disappeared, and this cool erotic cult of dancing, in an old extinct volcano kind of went defunct. And it's like, but there's a distinction there, right? But for me, between sort of like modern monotheistic religion and, Hindu and Vedic traditions that are so old, it's not clear to me they qualify under the Western taxonomy of religion versus something else, right? And so part of what I wanted to just say in making that point too, so one thing I really appreciate about this conversation is, right, that like Judaism is so long-lived that it combines both modern Western kind of monotheistic religion as such, and clearly a lot of older things that are really rich and really unclear, but for the definitions of, again, 19th century Europeans would be considered like, this is just religion, right? So spirit and soul, and like activating these other kinds of, I want to name them as real, not as just figural or just metaphorical resources, not just products of our modern imagination, but actual preserved live forces, right, that remain unresolved. And so the androgynous and the eunuch to me seem like two messengers of that. If we are to follow those two critical modes right up to the edge, hit the brick wall, and then turn around and say, I want more, right? And I think that's what Max's book does so beautifully, and what you've been speaking to as well, Joy. But I think that that's so important to do so that we don't find ourselves immiserated for the 1,000,000th time in 2022, when it turns out we did it, y'all. We exposed evangelical Christians as liars, but then where are we? Trapped in fleshly bodies again and going to the doctor for medicine. I love the idea of there being more to it than that. So partially that's also just a way to say thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation. But you both should have the last words.
Do you want it? Well, on one foot, as we would say, there's so much to say, and that was such a beautiful, thank you, both of you. Thank you so much. And I think like one of the things I try and do is allow myself at least flights of fancy in the book. Like, I'm going to write a short story. I'm going to imagine there's there's parts of my archives, we could think about the violence of the archives. There's all sorts of really great writing on archives and the kinds of deliberate ways they parse the subject to leave certain perspectives out. And that's true of our archive, but that does not forestall me from imagining what those perspectives might have looked like, right? From an imaginary journey alongside the androgyne and roosters in the book. And I don't know if it's a successful experiment. It's very different from the genre of most rabbinics books in my field. But it is a way, it is right, I am at that wall and I'm trying to think of a different way to approach the question that doesn't just end there with the lack, just doesn't just mark the lack, or at least marks it in a different way. But I'm so grateful. This has been so much fun. I really, really appreciate it.
I would just like to say that I think we need to stop confusing the fundamentalism with religion in the sense of a path of spiritual engagement. Fundamentalism is about restriction of human possibility, restriction of interpretation, and you can't have fundamentalism without guaranteed meaning, right? You need to know what the rules are and what the texts say, and then you project the guaranteed meaning onto what you call a divine figure. However, fun fact, divine figures are not billboards on which human ideas get to be projected. In fact, the sacred texts we have, and I would include, I know the Torah a little, somewhat, I know the Gospels much, much less, but in both of them, the image of the divine is that it is constantly rebelling against what human beings assume the order is. The Exodus from Egypt was clearly staged as a demonstration that this form of divinity that wants a relationship with humanity is one that overthrows human hierarchies and that rewrites human history. It just trashes, the might of Pharaoh in Egypt and the categories of slave and all of it, which get reinscribed later. But you know what I mean? It's not that God is invested in the Torah in all of the ideas that I wish God was invested in the Torah. It's not that. It's just that God is invested in showing that God is not bound or defined by human ideas. Much as I would like to think that God would vote the same way that I do, that is idolatry. And there are many Christians who would say that these forms of what we think of as Christianity, as they become more and more identified with political positions, they've become less and less religious. And there are actually a number of forms of idolatry that have done very well on the Christian, what we call the Christian right. But what the rest of us need to do is stop being bound up in a discourse that is not only not sacred, but it's desacralizing. It's a chilul Hashem. It is defaming the idea of divinity. It's rendering it toxic. We just have to stop engaging with it as a religious discourse. Nothing good can come of that. We have to resist it politically and look for religion and living religious traditions elsewhere, divine human encounters, wherever there are divine, the purpose of divinity in so many of our texts is to remind people that we are not bound by oppressive, limited human structures and ideas. Over and over and over again. We need them. Religions come with bundles of these, laws and norms and this kind of stuff. But the idea is that there is always this beyond, what is outside the human structures that we take so much comfort in, and that freedom and possibility are always there, and that we get those by having a real relationship with a divine that we can't understand.
Thank you so much, all of you. This is really incredible. Yeah, I got so much out of this, and it seems like you all have too. So I'm gonna wrap us up for the night. I I'm now returning to my initial question about whether we should all start a radical yeshiva in earnest. Um, but yeah, I really love this, and thank you again. Thank you again to Cynthia and Jewish Currents for making this happen, and thank you all for coming.